The spotlight burned hot on my face, but the heat didn't bother me. I strummed the first chord, the familiar sound echoing through the packed concert hall. The audience was electric, but my mind was elsewhere. Tonight wasn't just another performance, it was a reckoning. As my fingers danced across the guitar strings, I could see Amanda sitting in the front row, just to the left of the stage. She was smiling, completely unaware of what was about to unfold. It felt strange, knowing that the woman I had shared a life with, the woman I had built everything with, had no idea that this concert wasn't about the music. It was about the end. I hit the next chord harder, pulling the audience deeper into the song. The track was one of our first, a love song we had written together, back when we believed that music could solve anything. I closed my eyes, letting the memory wash over me. We met in a dingy little music studio on the outskirts of town, both trying to find our place in the world. Amanda's voice, soft yet powerful, had captivated me from the start. It wasn't long before we were inseparable, both on stage and off. The connection we had, the fire we shared, seemed invincible. I opened my eyes, glancing at Amanda again. She was watching me, but her mind was probably on him. Dylan, the pianist, young, talented, and oblivious to the destruction he'd caused. But tonight wasn't about him either. This was about her and me. Our story played out in front of everyone who had once believed in us. The second song began, a track about the early days of our marriage. The audience swayed to the rhythm, but I could feel the shift in Amanda's posture. She recognized the song. We'd written it in our tiny apartment, long before we had record deals and sold-out shows. Back then, it was just the two of us against the world. But the world caught up. I could pinpoint the exact moment when Amanda started to drift. It wasn't sudden, it was a slow fade, masked by rehearsals and studio time. At first, I thought it was just stress from the tour. From the pressure of being Josh and Amanda, the duo everyone loved. But then I noticed the late-night texts, the way her eyes lit up when Dylan walked into the room. The next song began, darker, heavier. The lyrics spoke of doubt, of distance creeping in where love used to be. I could feel the crowd sensing the shift in tone, but they had no idea what was coming next. Amanda sat stiffly now, her smile fading. She was beginning to understand. I had planned it all meticulously. This wasn't going to be some public fight, some tabloid scandal. No, this was going to be a performance, my final act. Every song tonight was part of the story, from the beginning to the bitter end. And the grand finale? That would be for Amanda alone. As the last notes of the third track rang out, I could see her eyes darting around the room, looking for some kind of escape. But there was none. Not tonight. She was going to listen to every word, every chord, every truth I had buried beneath the music. And when it was all over, she would know what I had known for weeks. Our love wasn't just dead, it had been murdered. I stepped up to the mic, my voice steady. This next song, I said, locking eyes with Amanda, is for someone very special. The crowd erupted in cheers, thinking it was another love song. But Amanda knew better. The applause echoed through the hall, but all I could hear was the pounding in my chest. I glanced at Amanda again. Her face had gone pale, her hands gripping the edges of her seat. She knew now. Amanda's eyes were locked on me now, no longer scanning the crowd. She could feel it, the shift. This was no longer a shared story of our love. It was a dissection of her betrayal. The audience didn't know that yet, they still swayed to the rhythm, blissfully unaware of the personal war being fought on stage. But Amanda knew. She had to. The fourth song was about the beginning of the end. I hadn't written the lyrics with subtlety in mind. There was no point in being gentle when the truth had already been shattered. This wasn't the concert she had expected. I knew when it started with Dylan. That night in the studio, when I stayed late to finish a track, and Amanda had stayed even later, just not with me. I caught the way they lingered together, how she laughed too easily at his jokes, how he looked at her like she was more than just a fellow musician. I told myself it was nothing at first. Just studio banter, just nerves from the pressure of the album. But the late nights piled up. The distance between us grew wider with each passing week. As the song faded into silence, I let the moment linger. I didn't rush into the next track. I wanted her to feel it, to sit with the weight of what was happening. I could see her lips tremble, her hands clutching the armrests like she was trying to hold on to something that was already gone. And then, without breaking eye contact, I began the final song of the set. The one I had written specifically for her. The one that would leave no doubt in anyone's mind about what had happened. The guitar chords were sharp and deliberate. I had told our story, from love to betrayal, in front of the people who had once cheered for us. And now, as the final song faded into silence, I knew that our story, our marriage, our love, was over. The audience began to clap, unsure at first, but then louder. They thought they had witnessed a brilliant performance, a work of art. But Amanda and I knew the truth. This wasn't just a show. This was the end. The applause swelled around me, but it felt distant, like it was coming from somewhere far away. I stood there, breathing heavily, gripping my guitar as if it were the only thing keeping me upright. The final notes still lingered in the air, the last remnants of a love that had once seemed unbreakable. I looked at Amanda. She hadn't moved. Her face was pale, and her eyes were wide, still fixed on me as if she couldn't believe what had just happened. The crowd's cheers grew louder, oblivious to the personal disaster they had just witnessed. To them, this was just a performance, another night of entertainment. They had no idea that they'd just seen our marriage die in real time. I could see the confusion on her face now. The realization was finally hitting her. This wasn't just some artistic expression. This wasn't just another song. I had laid everything bare, every lie, every moment of betrayal, and I had done it in front of hundreds of people. I lowered my guitar and stepped back from the microphone. The stage lights felt harsher now, brighter. I turned my back on the audience for a moment, letting them have their applause while I gathered myself. The adrenaline was starting to wear off, leaving me with nothing but the cold emptiness that always follows anger. Amanda's expression hadn't changed. She looked stunned, as if she was still trying to process the fact that I knew everything. Dylan's name wasn't in the song, but she didn't need it to be. The details I had laid out were clear enough. There was no hiding anymore. I moved toward the side of the stage, my heart pounding in my chest, unsure of what would happen next. The crowd's applause was deafening now, but I wasn't hearing it. My focus was entirely on her. I half expected her to stand up and leave, to storm out in humiliation. But she stayed rooted to her seat, frozen. After what felt like an eternity, the lights finally dimmed, and the applause started to die down. I stepped off the stage, making my way through the backstage area. My head was spinning, and my pulse raced. I had done it. I had told the truth. But it didn't feel like a victory. I heard footsteps behind me, quick and urgent. It was Amanda. "Josh," she called, her voice shaky. I didn't turn around. I kept walking, my hands still trembling. I had no idea what she was going to say, but I wasn't sure I wanted to hear it. "Josh, wait." I stopped. I couldn't keep walking forever. Slowly, I turned to face her. Amanda stood there, her face a mixture of fear, anger, and something else, guilt, maybe? She took a step closer, her eyes searching mine. But I didn't give her anything. "What the hell was that?" she finally asked, her voice low but sharp. I shrugged, though the weight of the moment made it feel like a struggle. It was the truth. Her eyes flashed with anger. "You had no right to do that in front of everyone. I had every right," I interrupted, my voice rising despite myself. "You think I didn't know, Amanda? You think I couldn't feel it? Every late night, every lie, every time you stayed behind with him, I knew." She blinked, her eyes widening, and for a second, I thought I saw the flash of guilt again. But it was gone just as quickly. "You're wrong," she said, but the words sounded weak, unconvincing. She tried to hold her ground, but I wasn't going to let her twist this. "Am I?" I shot back. "You think this was just about the songs? That I made all this up for some dramatic effect? I saw the texts. I heard the phone calls. Don't insult me by pretending I don't know exactly what you did." She took a shaky breath, her eyes falling to the floor. "It wasn't like that." "Then what was it like, Amanda?" I demanded, stepping closer. "Tell me, how do you explain sneaking around behind my back with him, lying to me, making me think I was losing my mind? What exactly do you call that?" Her silence was answer enough. She couldn't look me in the eye anymore. I exhaled slowly, trying to calm the storm of emotions swirling inside me. "I put it all out there because I wanted you to feel what I felt. The humiliation, the betrayal, the pain, everything you put me through. I wanted you to sit in that seat and hear it the way I had to live it." Amanda looked up, her eyes now full of tears. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I didn't mean for it to get this far. I don't know what I was thinking." I shook my head. "It's too late for that, Amanda. You made your choices, and now you have to live with them." For a moment, we just stood there in silence. The concert hall was still buzzing with the sounds of people filtering out. But in this small backstage corridor, it felt like the world had shrunk to just the two of us. I never wanted to hurt you, she said softly, wiping at her eyes. I don't even know why. I don't know why I did it. I swallowed hard, forcing down the lump in my throat. Maybe you didn't, but you did, and now there's nothing left to fix. She looked like she wanted to say something else, but I wasn't interested in hearing it. I had said everything I needed to on that stage. There was no going back now. Without another word, I turned and walked away, leaving her standing alone in the dim light of the backstage corridor. The truth had been told, the performance complete, but the aftermath of our broken marriage was only just beginning. I left Amanda behind in that dim corridor, the weight of everything pressing on me, threatening to collapse whatever strength I had left. The performance was over, but the fallout had only just begun. I walked through the backstage exit and out into the cold night air. It hit me like a slap, sharp and sobering. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe, but the clarity came with a painful realization. I had spent years building something with Amanda, our music, our lives, our future, and in the course of one night, I had shattered it all. But it wasn't just me. She had been breaking it long before tonight, piece by piece, lie by lie. I pulled out a cigarette, lit it, and leaned against the brick wall outside the venue. I could still hear the murmurs of the crowd leaving. The whispers of excitement from people who thought they had just witnessed some kind of genius artistic moment. To them, it was just another performance, something to discuss over drinks or tweet about. But to me, it was the end of everything. I took a long drag, watching the smoke curl up into the night sky. The city lights blurred as the adrenaline drained from my system. I had been living for this moment, for the chance to expose Amanda, to make her feel the pain she had caused. But now that it was over, I wasn't sure what was left. Footsteps approached, and I looked up to see Dylan, standing awkwardly a few feet away. His face was pale, and his hands fidgeted in his pockets. He didn't know what to say, and honestly, I didn't want to hear anything from him. But there he was, the man who had inserted himself into my life and my marriage like a parasite. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice cold. He cleared his throat, looking around nervously. I didn't know you knew." I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. "You really thought I wouldn't find out? You thought I'd just keep playing dumb while you screwed around with my wife?" Dylan shifted uncomfortably, his eyes dropping to the ground. "I'm sorry, man. I didn't mean for it to get this far." "That's the second time I've heard that tonight," I muttered, taking another drag from my cigarette. "It's funny how people say that after they've already done the damage." "I didn't want to hurt anyone," Dylan said quietly. I flicked the cigarette to the ground and stepped on it, crushing it beneath my heel. "Well, congratulations. You did." Dylan's face tightened, but he didn't argue. He knew there was no defense for what he'd done. After a long pause, he finally spoke again, his voice soft. "I don't know what happens next. I'm sorry for everything." "Sorry doesn't change anything," I said, turning to leave. "You should have thought about that before you decided to tear someone's life apart." Without another glance, I walked away from him. I couldn't stand to be near him any longer. The night felt colder now, and the emptiness in my chest felt heavier. I didn't know where I was going, but anywhere was better than standing there in the ruins of what had once been my life. The morning after the concert, everything was different. The adrenaline from the performance had faded, and all that remained was the cold reality of what had happened. Amanda and I had spent the night apart. I hadn't bothered going home. Instead, I'd crashed on the couch at a friend's place, drinking away the numbness until sleep finally took over. When I woke up, there were dozens of texts and missed calls from Amanda. I didn't read any of them. I didn't need to. I knew what they would say: apologies, explanations, desperate attempts to make sense of something that couldn't be undone. I stared at my phone, the screen glowing with her name, and for a moment, I considered answering. Maybe we could talk it through. Maybe we could salvage something from the wreckage. But the anger was still there, simmering beneath the surface. She had betrayed me in the worst way possible. And no amount of talking would change that. Instead of calling her back, I stood up, grabbed my jacket, and headed out the door. The streets were busy with morning commuters, people going about their lives, unaware of the personal hell I was living in. I walked without a destination, just letting my feet carry me away from everything. I didn't want to deal with Amanda, with Dylan, or with the aftermath of the concert. Eventually, I found myself in front of the music studio where we had spent so many nights recording together. The memories hit me like a punch to the gut. This place had once been my sanctuary, where Amanda and I created something beautiful. Now it was tainted, a reminder of the lies and betrayal that had torn us apart. I walked inside, the familiar smell of coffee and old equipment filling the air. The studio was empty. No one else was scheduled to record today. It was just me, the silence, and the weight of everything I had lost. I sat down at the piano, running my fingers over the keys. The sound was soft and melancholic as I played a few notes. Music had always been my escape, my way of processing the world. But now, it felt different. The notes were heavier and more deliberate, like each one was pulling me deeper into the pain I was trying to avoid. I closed my eyes, letting my hands move over the keys, creating a melody that reflected the chaos inside me. It wasn't the triumphant revenge I had imagined. It was something darker, more uncertain. I had gotten my revenge, but it hadn't fixed anything. Amanda's betrayal still hung over me, a shadow I couldn't shake. As the melody took shape, I realized something: this wasn't just the end of my marriage. It was the end of an era. The music Amanda and I had created together was no longer ours. It had been broken, just like everything else. And now, I had to figure out who I was without her. I spent hours in the studio that day, letting the music pull me through every emotion I'd been burying. Each note that echoed in the room felt like a release, like I was emptying out the chaos Amanda's betrayal had left inside me. But when I finally stopped playing, I was still left with the same, heavy silence. Nothing had changed. I stared at the piano for a while, wondering how things had gotten so far off track. I thought about our early days, Amanda and me, hungry for success, for recognition. We'd been inseparable, two people with a single dream. Music had been our bond, the language we used to say what words couldn't. And now, I wasn't sure if I could ever play with her again. The door to the studio creaked open behind me, and I didn't need to turn around to know who it was. I could feel her presence like a weight in the air. Amanda stepped inside, quietly shutting the door behind her. For a moment, she didn't say anything, just stood there in the doorway like she was waiting for permission to speak. I kept my back to her, my fingers still resting on the piano keys. "Josh," she said, her voice low, hesitant. I said nothing. I wasn't sure what I could say. The performance had been the last word for me, everything I needed to express. I'd already done in front of hundreds of people. But here she was, wanting something from me. Maybe it was closure, maybe forgiveness. I didn't know if I had either to give. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice shaking just enough to let me know she was serious. "I know that doesn't change anything, but I need you to know. I never meant for this to happen." I sighed, the sound of her words hitting me like a dull thud. "You've already said that." "I know," she said, stepping closer. I could hear her footsteps on the wooden floor. "But I've been thinking about everything, about us, and I know I messed up. I hurt you. I hurt everything we built." There was silence again, hanging heavy between us. I still hadn't turned to look at her. I didn't want to see the regret in her eyes. Part of me wanted to stay angry, to hold on to that bitterness because it was easier than forgiving her. Easier than facing the fact that I wasn't sure if I could ever trust her again. "You didn't just hurt me, Amanda," I said finally, my voice quieter than I intended. "You broke us. You broke everything." Her breath caught, and I heard her take a step back as if the truth of my words had physically hit her. "I know," she whispered. "And I don't know how to fix it." I turned to face her then, my eyes meeting hers. She looked fragile and vulnerable in a way I hadn't seen in a long time. The strong, determined woman I'd built a life with was gone, replaced by someone who was just as lost as I was. "I don't know if we can fix it," I said, my words heavy with the weight of everything we'd been through. "Maybe it's too late." Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back. She wasn't the type to cry easily, and seeing her like this was a reminder of just how far we had fallen. "I don't want it to be too late," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I still love you, Josh." I never stopped. Love. The word hung in the air between us like a distant echo. There had been love once, no doubt. But now? I wasn't sure. Could love survive this kind of betrayal? Could it survive the bitterness? The anger, the humiliation? I didn't have an answer for her. "I need time," I said finally, my voice strained. "I need space to figure out what's left." Amanda nodded, wiping at her eyes. She looked like she wanted to say more, but she didn't. She just turned and left, leaving me alone in the studio with nothing but the faint echo of my own words. The days that followed were a blur of silence and distance. Amanda and I were living in the same space, but it felt like we were worlds apart. We tiptoed around each other, careful to avoid confrontation, but it wasn't the calm before the storm, it was the aftermath of one. The damage had already been done, and we were just picking up the pieces, unsure of what to do next. Every time I looked at her, I felt a mix of emotions I couldn't sort out. Anger, sadness, betrayal. But there was something else, too. Something I didn't want to admit, an aching sense of loss. Not just of our relationship, but of the person Amanda had been to me. My partner, my collaborator, my best friend. One night, after another day of silence, I found myself back at the piano. It had become my refuge again, the one place I could lose myself in something other than the mess of my personal life. I sat there, my fingers lightly touching the keys, unsure of what to play. The door creaked open, and I knew without looking that it was Amanda. She stood at the doorway, her presence soft but unmistakable. "You mind if I join you?" she asked quietly. I hesitated but then nodded. She moved toward the piano and sat beside me, her fingers hovering over the keys. For a moment, we didn't say anything. It felt strange, being this close after everything that had happened, but the music was a bridge between us, something that hadn't completely crumbled. She started playing a simple melody, one I recognized from years ago when we had first started writing music together. It was a piece we had worked on in our early days, something light and hopeful. I joined in, letting my hands follow hers, and for a few minutes, the tension between us seemed to melt away. When the melody ended, we sat in the quiet, the sound of the last notes fading into the room. "I miss this," she said softly, her voice barely audible. "I miss us." I swallowed hard, not trusting myself to speak. The truth was, I missed it too. But it wasn't that simple. What we had now wasn't the same as what we had then. The betrayal had changed things, maybe irreparably. "I don't know if we can get back to that," I said, my voice low. Amanda nodded, her eyes focused on the keys. "I know, but I want to try." For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of something. Hope, maybe? It was small and fragile, but it was there. We were broken, that much was clear. But maybe, just maybe, there was a chance to rebuild something. It wouldn't be the same. It couldn't be. But maybe it could be something new. I didn't have the answers yet. I didn't know if I could ever fully forgive her or if I even wanted to. But for now, I was willing to try. To see if we could find something worth holding on to, even in the ashes of what we used to be. "Let's take it one day at a time," I said, turning to face her. "No promises. No expectations." She looked at me, her eyes filled with a mix of hope and uncertainty. "Okay," she whispered. And so, we sat there in the quiet, side by side, not knowing what the future held, but willing to face it together, at least for now. We were fragile, like the delicate notes of the song we had just played. But there was a shared understanding that this was the beginning of something. Whether it was healing or simply acceptance, only time would tell. We didn't say anything else that night. Instead, we just let the silence fill the space between us, as we sat together at the piano, waiting to see what would come next. The days began to blur into each other. Amanda and I kept our fragile peace, but it was more like living in a truce than a real marriage. We avoided the hard conversations, filling the silence with music instead. I'd come home, and we'd sit at the piano, playing our way through the awkwardness, through the unspoken feelings. Music had always been our connection, but now it felt like a bandage, a temporary fix over a deeper wound. One night, a few weeks after that first tentative session, Amanda suggested something unexpected. "Why don't we perform together again?" she asked as we finished another late-night session in the studio. "We could use the music to work through this." I looked at her, surprised. Performing together had always been our thing, our way of communicating when words failed us. But after everything that had happened, the idea of sharing a stage with her again felt impossible. "I don't know if I'm ready for that," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Amanda didn't push, but I could see the disappointment in her eyes. She was desperate to find a way back, to use music as a bridge between us. Part of me wanted to believe it could work. After all, it was the only thing we still shared. But the anger was still there, buried deep beneath the surface. "I get it," she said softly. "I just thought, maybe we could try." We sat in silence for a while after that, the tension hanging in the air. I wanted to believe that performing together could help, that it could bring us closer the way it used to. But every time I looked at her, all I could think about was the betrayal. I'll think about it, I said eventually, not wanting to shut her down completely. She nodded, giving me a small, hopeful smile. That's all I'm asking. I left the studio that night feeling torn. I didn't know if I could face the audience with her again, knowing everything that had happened. But I also couldn't deny that something inside me still longed for that connection, for the simplicity of playing music together like we used to. As I walked home, my mind kept circling back to that thought: could music really heal us? Or were we just trying to force something that was already broken beyond repair? A few days later, I found myself standing on the stage again, but this time, I was alone. The venue was empty, the seats stretching out in front of me like a sea of unanswered questions. I hadn't performed solo in years. Amanda had always been by my side, and the idea of doing this without her felt strange. But maybe that was what I needed, a moment to rediscover who I was outside of us. I sat down at the piano and closed my eyes, letting my fingers hover over the keys. The room was silent, but in my mind, I could still hear the echoes of our last performance together, the concert where I had exposed her betrayal for the world to see. It felt like a lifetime ago, and yet, the pain was still fresh, still raw. I started to play, letting the music flow out of me. It wasn't planned, wasn't rehearsed. It was just an outpouring of everything I had been holding inside. The melody was haunting, filled with unresolved tension and quiet anger. As I played, I felt the weight of the last few months lift. Just a little. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was playing for myself. But as the music swelled, so did the memories. I couldn't shake the image of Amanda sitting beside me, her fingers moving effortlessly over the keys as we played in perfect harmony. I missed that connection. The way we used to communicate without words, how the music was always enough. And maybe that's why I stopped, my hands frozen above the keys. I couldn't finish the song. Not without her. I stood up abruptly, the silence in the room deafening. I wasn't ready to let go of what we had. Not yet. Later that night, I found myself back at the apartment. Amanda was there, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, looking as lost as I felt. She looked up when I walked in, her eyes searching mine for something. Hope, maybe, or forgiveness. I was thinking about what you said, I told her, leaning against the doorway. About performing together. Her eyes widened a little, and she set her cup down carefully. And, I'm willing to try, I said, the words feeling heavy as I spoke them. But this isn't going to fix everything. Amanda nodded, her face softening with relief. I know. I don't expect it to. I want to try. We sat together at the table for a while, not saying much. The silence between us was different now, less tense, more open. There was still so much to work through, but for the first time, I felt like we were both willing to take the steps, however small, to figure it out. We'll take it slow, I said finally, breaking the silence. One performance at a time. Amanda smiled, the first real smile I'd seen from her in weeks. That's all I need. It wasn't a grand declaration of love or forgiveness. It wasn't the happy ending I'd always imagined for us. But it was something, a start. We weren't the same people we had been before, and our relationship wasn't either. But maybe, with time and patience, we could build something new. The music had always been our way of communicating. And now, it would be our way of healing. One note at a time. The decision to perform together again felt like both a step forward and a leap into the unknown. Amanda and I hadn't talked much since we agreed to try. It was as though we were both afraid that if we spoke too openly, we'd ruin whatever fragile thread we were holding onto. The tension was still there, but we masked it with rehearsals, treating the music like it could somehow heal the wounds we weren't ready to address. Our first rehearsal together was awkward. We sat at the piano in the studio, the same one where we'd written our biggest hits, where we'd spent countless hours creating music that had connected us more than words ever could. Now, the connection felt brittle, like it could snap at any moment. Amanda started playing the opening chords of one of our earlier pieces, and I joined in after a few beats, my fingers moving stiffly over the keys. The music was there, but it lacked the emotion that had always flowed so naturally between us. We're rusty, Amanda said after a few minutes, her voice tight. She wasn't wrong, but it felt like she was talking about more than just the music. Yeah, I muttered, avoiding her gaze. It'll take time. She didn't respond, just nodded and went back to playing. The song was familiar, but it didn't feel like it belonged to us anymore. We were going through the motions, trying to recapture something that might already be lost. After a while, we stopped playing, both of us sitting in silence. I could tell Amanda wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. I felt the same. There was so much unsaid between us, so much we were avoiding. But now wasn't the time. We weren't ready yet. We'll get there, I said finally, more for myself than for her. Amanda gave me a small, tired smile. I hope so. We finished the rehearsal and left the studio in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. It was clear that rebuilding our musical connection wasn't going to be as easy as we'd hoped. But we were trying, and that had to count for something. The night of the performance came sooner than I expected. We were playing at a small, intimate venue, nothing like the larger stages we'd grown used to. It felt fitting, in a way. This wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about seeing if we could still find the music that had once held us together. As I stood backstage, waiting for our cue, I could feel the familiar nerves creeping in. But this time, it wasn't just stage fright. It was something deeper, a fear that this performance would show us exactly what we had lost. That no matter how hard we tried, we'd never be able to go back to the way things were. Amanda stood next to me, her hands fidgeting with the edge of her dress. She looked nervous too, though she was trying to hide it. We hadn't spoken much since the rehearsal. There was still so much hanging between us, but tonight wasn't the time for those conversations. Tonight was about the music. When the stage manager gave us the nod, we walked out together, the soft murmur of the audience fading as the spotlight hit us. I took my place at the piano, and Amanda stood beside me, her guitar in hand. For a moment, we just stood there, the weight of everything pressing down on us. Then, Amanda began to play. The opening chords were soft and hesitant, but they grew stronger as she found her rhythm. I joined in, my fingers moving over the keys with more confidence than I had expected. The music filled the room, wrapping around us like a familiar embrace. For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of the connection we used to have. As the song progressed, something shifted. The tension between us eased, and the music started to flow naturally again. It was like muscle memory kicking in, our bodies remembering what our minds couldn't quite grasp. We weren't the same as before, but in that moment, we were enough. When we finished the song, the audience erupted in applause. I glanced over at Amanda, and for the first time in a long time, she smiled at me, really smiled. It wasn't the forced, polite smile she'd been giving me for weeks. It was genuine, filled with relief and maybe even hope. We played a few more songs, each one building on the last. By the end of the set, I could feel the shift between us. The music hadn't healed everything, but it had reminded us of what we used to have. It had opened a door, just a crack, to the possibility of something new. After the final song, we stood together, taking in the applause. For a brief moment, it felt like the old days, like we were still a team, still creating something beautiful together. But when the applause faded and the stage lights dimmed, reality crept back in. As we packed up our instruments backstage, the weight of everything unsaid hung in the air. We had survived the performance, but the question still lingered. Could we really rebuild what we had? Could music be enough to bridge the gap between us? I'm glad we did this, Amanda said quietly as she put her guitar away. Me too, I replied, though my mind was still swirling with uncertainty. We stood there for a moment, neither of us quite ready to leave, but unsure of what to say next. The music had brought us back together for one night, but what happened after that was still a mystery. Maybe we could write something new, Amanda suggested, her voice tentative. Something that's just for us. I nodded, though I wasn't sure if I was ready for that. Writing music together had always been our way of communicating. But now, it felt risky. What if the new music couldn't hold us together? What if it revealed just how broken we really were? We'll see, I said, not wanting to commit to more than I could handle. Amanda looked at me, her eyes searching mine for some kind of reassurance. I didn't have any to give. We were still standing at the edge, unsure if we were going to fall or if we could catch ourselves in time. But for now, the music had given us a moment of peace. It wasn't a solution, but it was a start. And that was enough for tonight. The next few weeks were a mix of quiet tension and fleeting moments of connection. Amanda and I played together more often, slowly rediscovering the rhythm we'd lost. Each session was like a step forward, a brief escape from the reality of everything that had happened. But the silence between the music still weighed heavy. We hadn't addressed the core of our problems, and I knew it was only a matter of time before it all came crashing down again. One night, after another long rehearsal, I sat down at the piano alone. Amanda had already gone to bed, and I needed a moment to myself. I began to play, my fingers moving over the keys without thought, pouring out the tangled emotions that had been building up for months. The melody was haunting, filled with the pain and anger I hadn't been able to voice. As I played, an idea started to take shape, a song, but not just any song. A song for Amanda, one that would tell our story, from the beginning to the end. A song that would expose everything, just like that first performance when I had revealed her betrayal to the world. But this time, it would be different. This time, it wouldn't just be about revenge. It would be about truth. I stayed up late that night, writing. The words flowed out of me in a way they hadn't in months. Each line was raw and brutally honest, capturing every stage of our relationship, the love, the betrayal, the confusion, and the anger. But there was something else, too, something softer, buried beneath the hurt. A longing for the connection we'd once had, a recognition that despite everything, a part of me still cared. When I finally finished the song, I sat back and looked at the pages in front of me. It was the most personal thing I'd ever written. It was also the most painful. The next morning, I showed it to Amanda. She was sitting at the kitchen table, sipping her coffee, when I slid the sheets of music in front of her. She looked up at me, confused. "What's this?" "A new song," I said, my voice quiet. "I wrote it for you." Amanda hesitated for a moment, her eyes flickering with uncertainty before she reached for the pages. As she started to read, I watched her expression change, first confusion, then surprise, and finally, something I couldn't quite place. By the time she finished, her hands were trembling. "You wrote this, about us," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. She looked down at the pages again, her eyes scanning the lyrics. "It's beautiful, but it's also so painful. Why would you want to perform this?" "Because it's the truth," I said, my voice firmer than I expected. "It's everything I've been feeling, everything we've been avoiding. We can't keep pretending that we're fine, Amanda. We're not." Amanda stared at me, her eyes filling with tears. "I know we're not fine, but performing this, it's like exposing every wound we have." I walked over to the piano and sat down, my hands hovering over the keys. Maybe that's what we need. Maybe the only way to move forward is to stop hiding from the pain. Amanda stood there for a moment, her arms wrapped around herself like she was trying to hold everything together. Then, slowly, she walked over and sat beside me on the bench. "Play it," she said quietly. I hesitated for a moment, then started to play. The melody filled the room, soft and haunting, carrying with it the weight of everything we'd been through. As I played, Amanda began to sing the lyrics, her voice trembling at first but growing stronger with each line. The words hung in the air between us, raw and unfiltered, exposing every emotion we'd been trying to bury. By the time we reached the final verse, I could feel the tears burning in my eyes. I glanced over at Amanda, and I saw that she was crying too. But she kept singing, her voice steady even as the tears fell. When the song ended, we sat in silence for a long time, the weight of the moment pressing down on us. Neither of us spoke, there was nothing left to say. We had laid everything bare in that song, every hurt, every regret, every lingering feeling. Finally, Amanda turned to me, her voice shaky. "What happens now?" I looked at her, my chest tight with the enormity of the question. What did happen now? The song had brought us closer in some ways, but it also forced us to confront the truth. Our relationship was broken, and no amount of music could fix that. But maybe, just maybe, it could help us understand it. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice hoarse. "But we can't go back. We have to figure out what comes next." Amanda nodded, wiping the tears from her face. "I want to keep playing together," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Even if we can't fix everything, I still want that." I didn't know if we could keep playing together, not like this. But I nodded anyway because, at that moment, it was the only thing that felt right. We couldn't pretend anymore, but we also couldn't let go of the music that had always been our lifeline. As we sat there, the silence between us no longer felt as heavy. The song had opened a door, even if it hadn't provided all the answers. We still had a long way to go, but at least now, we were being honest with each other, and with ourselves. For the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. The night of the concert had finally arrived. I stood backstage, staring at the setlist pinned to the wall. Every song, every chord, every lyric was a piece of the life Amanda and I had built and then shattered. The audience outside was buzzing, unaware that tonight's performance was more than just a musical event. For them, it was another show, another glimpse into the lives of two artists they admired. But for Amanda and me, it was the final act in a story that had no happy ending. The stage crew moved around me, setting up the instruments and checking the sound, but I barely noticed. My mind was on the last song, the one I had written for Amanda. The one that would expose everything. It was our story, laid bare for everyone to hear, for Amanda to hear. I didn't know how she would react. Hell, I didn't know how I would react once it was all out there, but I couldn't back out now. This was the only way I knew how to let go. Amanda entered the room quietly, her guitar slung over her shoulder. She caught my eye, and for a moment, we just looked at each other. No words, no forced smiles, just the reality of what we were about to do. "Ready?" she asked, her voice steady, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. "As ready as I'll ever be," I said, my throat dry. I could tell she felt the weight of the night too. We didn't say anything else as we walked to the stage. The lights were low, the audience murmuring in anticipation. The atmosphere was electric, but for me, it felt like walking into a storm. The first few songs went smoothly. They were the ones people knew, the ones we had written when things were still good. Amanda and I fell into our usual rhythm, playing off each other like we always had. But there was something different now, a sense of finality, of saying goodbye with each note. And then, we reached the last song. I sat at the piano, the sheet music in front of me even though I didn't need it. I had memorized every line, every chord. I glanced at Amanda, who had her guitar resting in her lap, her fingers trembling slightly as she adjusted the strings. "This next song," I said into the microphone, my voice echoing in the quiet room, "is one we've never played before. It's a new piece, something personal. Something that tells our story." I could feel the audience lean in, their curiosity piqued. But I wasn't playing for them. I was playing for Amanda. For me, for the closure we both needed. I began to play. The opening notes were soft and tentative, like the beginning of our relationship. The lyrics painted a picture of those early days, of the excitement, the passion, and the feeling that we were unstoppable. Amanda's voice joined mine, her singing delicate and full of emotion. For a moment, it was like we were back there, in those days before everything had gone wrong. But as the song progressed, the tone shifted. The chords grew darker and heavier. The lyrics started to unravel the cracks in our marriage. The doubts, the unspoken frustrations. I could feel Amanda falter beside me, her voice catching as she realized where the song was headed. And then came the final verse, the one about her affair. The room seemed to hold its breath as I sang the words I had written in the quiet of our empty house. The betrayal, the anger, the confusion, it all poured out of me, wrapped in the music. Amanda's voice was silent now. She wasn't singing. She just sat there, staring down at her guitar as the truth washed over her. When the last note faded, the room was deathly silent. For a moment, it felt like the world had stopped. I could hear my own breathing, heavy and ragged. I glanced at Amanda, but she wouldn't look at me. Her hands were shaking, her face pale under the stage lights. The audience erupted in applause, but it felt distant, like it wasn't really for me. Like it wasn't for us. Amanda stood up abruptly, her guitar slung over her shoulder, and walked off the stage without a word. I stayed behind, frozen, staring at the empty space where she had been. The applause continued, but it felt hollow. I had done what I came here to do, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like an ending. I followed Amanda backstage, my heart pounding in my chest. She was standing by the door, her arms wrapped around herself, her back to me. "Amanda," I said, my voice hoarse. She didn't turn around. "I didn't write that song to hurt you," I continued, stepping closer. "I wrote it because I needed to let go. I needed to tell the truth, even if it hurts." Amanda finally turned to face me, her eyes red, tears streaming down her face. "You think I didn't already know the truth, Josh? You think I haven't been living with it every single day?" Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. "I know you have," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. "But we never talked about it. We never faced it. And we can't move forward until we do." Amanda wiped her face, her expression hardening. "Move forward? Do you think this is going to help us move forward?" You just exposed the most painful part of our lives to a room full of strangers. I had nothing to say. She was right. I don't know if we can come back from this, Amanda whispered, her voice breaking. I don't know if I can. And with that, she turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, alone. The applause had stopped. The lights were off. And I realized, at that moment, that the music was over. I stood in the empty dressing room, the echo of the audience's applause now long gone. The silence felt heavier than the music ever did, a void that swallowed every thought. Every emotion. Amanda was gone, not just from the stage but from the part of me that once believed we could fix this. I sank down onto the old leather couch, the creak of the cushions breaking the silence for a brief moment before everything fell quiet again. My head was spinning. The song had been everything I wanted it to be, raw, honest, and cathartic. But as the final note faded, so did the hope that this performance could bring us any closer to understanding. Instead, it seemed to push us further apart. I pulled out my phone and stared at the blank screen, debating whether to call Amanda. What would I even say? Was there anything left to say? I had exposed everything and poured my heart out in front of hundreds of people, but the one person who needed to hear it had already walked away. A knock at the door pulled me from my thoughts. Josh? It was Mark, our tour manager. His voice was hesitant as if he already knew something was wrong. They're waiting for you. The press wants a few shots before the after party. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. The last thing I wanted to do was smile for cameras or answer questions about a performance that had ripped me apart from the inside. But this was the life we had chosen, the life Amanda and I had both prioritized over everything else. The show must go on, right? I'll be there in a minute, I muttered, my voice flat. Mark lingered for a second before closing the door softly behind him. I leaned back against the couch, staring up at the ceiling. I didn't want to go out there, put on a mask, and pretend like tonight had been just another gig. But what other choice did I have? I thought about Amanda, the way she had looked at me on stage when I sang those final lines. There was a flicker of something in her eyes, pain, yes, but also something deeper. Regret, maybe? Or was it simply the weight of knowing that we had reached the end of the road? I stood up, forcing myself to move. The sooner I got through this, the sooner I could try to figure out what came next. The backstage hallway was crowded with people, stagehands, crew members, and a few industry insiders who had managed to sneak in. I pushed through, offering nods and forced smiles to those who congratulated me on the performance. But it all felt hollow, like I was walking through a dream that wasn't mine anymore. As I stepped into the room where the press waited, the cameras flashed, and the questions started flying. How did it feel performing such a personal song? Do you think the audience understood the message behind the music? What's next for you and Amanda? That last question hit me harder than I expected. I glanced around, scanning the crowd, but Amanda was nowhere to be seen. She hadn't even stayed for this part, the part we were both supposed to handle together. I took a deep breath and gave the reporter a non-answer, something about focusing on the music and taking it one day at a time. But even as the words left my mouth, I knew they were empty. There was no one day at a time for us anymore. Not after tonight. After what felt like an eternity, I finally broke free from the press, slipping out of the side door and into the cool night air. The streets were quiet, the chaos of the concert hall fading behind me. I started walking, not really knowing where I was going, just needing to escape. My phone buzzed in my pocket. For a moment, I thought it might be Amanda, but when I pulled it out, it was just a text from Mark about tomorrow's schedule. I shoved it back into my pocket, frustration bubbling up inside me. I didn't care about tomorrow. I didn't care about any of this anymore. I found myself wandering toward the park a few blocks away, the same one where Amanda and I used to go after rehearsals. We'd sit on a bench, talking about music, about our future, about everything and nothing. Back then, it had felt like we had all the time in the world. I sat down on that same bench now, the memories swirling around me like ghosts. The last time we'd been here together, we had talked about our next album. Our next tour. We had been so focused on what came next that we hadn't even seen the cracks forming beneath us. And now, those cracks had turned into chasms. I leaned forward, my elbows resting on my knees, and stared down at the ground. I had thought the song would be the thing that finally broke through the wall between us, that it would force us to confront everything we had been avoiding. But I hadn't expected it to feel like this, so final, so empty. The truth was, I didn't know what came next. Not for me, not for Amanda. The music had always been the thing that brought us together, but now it felt like it had been the thing that tore us apart. I pulled out my phone again, staring at Amanda's name in my contacts. My finger hovered over the call button, but I couldn't bring myself to press it. Not yet. Maybe we both needed space. Maybe we both needed time to figure out who we were without each other. But even as I thought it, I knew it wasn't just time we needed. We needed to decide if there was anything left worth saving. With a sigh, I shoved the phone back into my pocket and stood up. The city lights glimmered in the distance, and somewhere beyond them, Amanda was probably asking herself the same questions I was. For now, all I could do was walk away. The music was over, and I wasn't sure if there was an encore left for us. But maybe, just maybe, this was the moment where the silence would finally speak louder than the songs ever could. It had been weeks since the concert, and the silence between Amanda and me felt heavier with each passing day. We hadn't spoken since that night. Not a text, not a call, nothing. It was as if the final note of that song had marked the end of everything, and neither of us knew how to break the quiet. I had thrown myself into work, burying the pain in rehearsals, recording sessions, anything that kept me from thinking too much. But every time I sat at the piano, the weight of what I'd lost settled in my chest like a stone. I could write 100 songs about betrayal, about love gone wrong, but none of them would change what had happened. None of them would bring Amanda back. One morning, as I sat at the kitchen table with my untouched cup of coffee, the doorbell rang. My heart jumped, half hoping it was her. Maybe she had come to talk, to try to patch things up. But when I opened the door, it wasn't Amanda. It was a courier, holding an envelope. "For Joshua Walker?" he asked, handing it to me. "Yeah, that's me," I replied, taking the envelope with a sinking feeling in my stomach. The return address was a lawyer's office. I didn't have to open it to know what it was. I stood in the doorway, the cool morning air brushing against my skin as I stared at the envelope in my hands. A part of me wanted to tear it open, to face the inevitable, but another part of me, the part that still held on to some small sliver of hope, didn't want to know. Eventually, I forced myself to rip it open. Inside was a letter from Amanda's lawyer, detailing the terms of our separation. Divorce. It was the final step in the unraveling of everything we'd built together. I couldn't say I was surprised. After that night, after what I'd done on stage, it felt inevitable. But knowing it was coming didn't make it hurt any less. I sat down at the table, staring at the papers in front of me. Each line was clinical, cold, a list of assets, accounts, and legal jargon that turned our life together into a business transaction. But underneath it all was the truth: Amanda was really leaving. The years we spent making music together, the late nights in the studio, the shared dreams, they were all reduced to this. I thought about texting her, asking her to talk one last time before we signed everything away. But what would I even say? The song had said everything. I had laid it all out in front of her, in front of everyone, and she had walked away. There was no taking that back. Later that evening, I sat at the piano, staring at the keys. The house was too quiet, the absence of Amanda's presence echoing in every corner. This was the first time I had sat down to play since the concert. And even now, it felt different. The music that used to flow effortlessly between us was gone, replaced by an emptiness I couldn't fill. I began to play, a slow melody that mirrored the way I felt, lost, broken, but somehow still moving forward. It wasn't a song about Amanda. It wasn't a song about the betrayal or the pain. It was just me, trying to make sense of what was left. As I played, I thought about all the moments we had shared. The small victories, the fights, the laughter. The nights we spent writing songs, imagining a future where music would always keep us together. And yet, here we were, two people who had been so in tune with each other, now completely out of sync. The song ended, but the sadness didn't fade. I knew I had to sign those papers, to let her go officially, but it still felt surreal. For so long, Amanda had been the constant in my life, the person who understood me in ways no one else could. And now, we were strangers, bound only by memories. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. I frowned, wondering who it could be at this hour. When I opened the door, my breath caught in my throat. Amanda stood there, looking as uncertain as I felt. "Hey," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Hey," I echoed, unsure of what else to say. For a long moment, we just stood there, neither of us knowing how to bridge the gap between us. She looked different, tired, maybe, or just worn down by the weight of everything we hadn't said. I got the papers, I finally said, gesturing toward the table. Amanda nodded, her eyes dropping to the floor. Yeah, I did too. We stood in awkward silence until she finally spoke again. I'm not here to fight, Josh. I needed to talk. I stepped aside, letting her in. She walked into the living room, her gaze lingering on the piano for a moment before she turned back to me. I don't know how to do this, she said, her voice breaking. I don't know how to just end everything. Neither do I admitted, sitting down across from her. For a moment, it felt like we were both searching for something, an answer, a way forward, maybe even a way back. But the space between us was too wide, filled with too many things unsaid. I didn't mean for it to happen, Amanda said suddenly, tears welling up in her eyes. With Dylan, I mean. I didn't set out to hurt you. I don't know. I was lost. I swallowed hard, my throat tight. I know. But that doesn't change what happened. I wish it did, she whispered. I wish we could go back to before everything fell apart. I nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. So do I. But we can't, Amanda. We can't undo what's been done. She wiped at her eyes, her shoulders slumping in defeat. So what do we do now? I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time in a long time, I saw the girl I had fallen in love with all those years ago. But she wasn't the same person anymore, and neither was I. I think we let each other go. I said quietly. For real this time. Amanda nodded, and though tears fell from her eyes, there was an understanding in her expression. We both knew this was the end, and there was no sense in pretending otherwise. She stood up, hesitating for a moment before leaning down to kiss me softly on the cheek. It was a goodbye, gentle, final. I'll sign the papers tomorrow, she whispered, her voice breaking once more. Goodbye, Josh. I watched her leave, the door closing behind her with a quiet click. The silence that followed felt different this time, sadder, but somehow more peaceful. I sat back down at the piano, resting my hands on the keys. The melody came to me, slow and mournful, but with a hint of hope. The music wasn't over. It was just beginning again, without her.